Alright, welcome my friends, associates, fellow gaming gurus, and so on. That includes you, Rob. You're the biggest guru out there that I know. This isn't in competition to the first video I made or Rob's video. I'm just pointing out that this is a continuation of the topic and subject of dwarves and dwarven culture, and potentially how to better understand and how to role play them. Now, I have two different sources here. I believe that I actually could have tapped into Shadowrun for additional forces, and of course every D&D GM guide I got, and I've got 3, all have a different, and the monster manuals from those versions all have a slight variant on describing dwarves. And I'm not going to be dragging all those out. I think Rob already covered quite a few. I think he covered all the GM's guides anyway in Monster Manual. So this isn't, like I said, trying to compete with it. It's just additional viable information. Now, for those of you who've never seen this particular stuff, this is 2nd edition Player's Handbook Rules Supplement, a complete book of dwarves for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. This would be 2.0. All right. This is an entire series. There's probably 20 or so books in this, and they come in blue, green, and in this maroonish color. This is what I assume some people refer to today as splat books, which by the term doesn't really apply. It's a source book, but is it necessary? I guess it depends. How much level of more information do you want on a given class, or a given race, or a given capability? Then these were good additions. And I may be wrong, but I think I've seen some updated versions of these for 3.5 sitting on the local bookstore shelf in the pre-owned section. I could be wrong, but I do not believe they've made any for 4.0 and 5.0. Maybe they chose not to. Maybe it's just the market won't support them, right? And there's a good reason, because probably half of what's in here you take or leave. It's a matter of perspective. And I'm not going to sit here and read the entire thing. I just want you, I want you to be aware of it, and it's there. You can probably get a free PDF version of this off the internet these days, or if you can, find them used, by all means, buy them. It gives the introduction, and like I said, I'm not going to go into a bunch of the stuff that I'm going to try to touch on things that were not touched in the first 2 videos without going into great depth. Rob did an awesome job of explaining both the nuances and attitudes and why dwarves are the way they are and so on, and this is just backing up what he says and what I already knew. In this case, Bowler, the Hill Dwarf, introduces the dwarves of the greatest race ever created by the gods. We are far superior to the manzy elves and smelly goblins, dirty orcs, and misshapen humans. Dwarves are perfectly shaped, solid, strong, like the stones that form our dwellings. Our skins are the color of the earth, our hair and beards the finest hue and texture imaginable. Dwarves are more than just attractive race, imbued with unchanging attitudes and steadfastness. We do not waver, even in the face of great adversity. Well suited to our lives underground, we can see in the dark, detect underground dangers and pitfalls. Our craftsmen have created the finest cities and buildings in the world. Our bridges and high vaulted chambers are wonders to behold, with a strength and permanence that a form that other races have never duplicated. We have no fear of magic. We shake off its effects as easily as we slay the goblins who lurk in the dark. We're impervious to poisons and noxious substances that kill those of lesser races, such as our vigor that even the cursed weapons fail to possess us, for inherent vitality is invincible. Dwarves are also great warriors, well-disciplined and organized into armies that strike fear into evil monsters everywhere. Our combat skills against the filthy dark dwellers are beyond question. Particularly stupid goblin, pig-faced orc, or blingless hobgoblin who does not quake with fear at the sound of dwarven boots. Our battle axes have drunk deeply of the blood of such creatures. Our hammers have smashed thousands of their skulls. We will continue until there are none left to kill. But that is not an idle boast, it is an oath. Yet we are a peaceful people. We do not seek war, nor do we steal from others. Those are the actions of other, less honorable races. We see to our own, and those who attempt to steal that which is ours will die. That is not a threat. It is the way of the dwarf. Do not wish to feel our wrath, then leave us alone. There you go. Dwarves as you know them. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and 2nd edition, so on and so forth. We get the D&D, early D&D version of the creation of the dwarf, the Dwarven history, and Dwarven gods. And we get a breakdown of, additional breakdown basically of the various standard category or subclasses or subraces of the dwarves: the hill dwarves, mountain dwarves, deep dwarves, sundered dwarves, Druger, otherwise known as the gray dwarves, and the gully dwarves. Now, I found this one is interesting because I hadn't looked at this particular sublet in a long time, and the fact that gully dwarves crop up here as well as Lord of the Rings is, you know, interesting. I know that J.R.R. Tolkien's work precedes either one of these game systems, and it heavily influenced the writers and creators of all this stuff. Most of us are at least passingly familiar with J.R.R. Tolkien's works. It's a rare individual in our hobby that doesn't at least understand the basics. And so, this is a creation of J.R.R. Tolkien, and it's made its way into D&D. Matter of fact, a lot of what we see of dwarves are based off of their interpretation or their twist of the stuff that J.R.R. Tolkien and other fantasy writers of that era created. And there weren't a lot of them. And I read a number of fantasy book series from the 70s, and there's a distinct change. I think Rob touched on it too. But by the time the mid-80s rolled around, D&D really became established, and a lot of things that were never quite defined in previous fantasy become more definable. And part because of the actions and the efforts of all the people involved in the D&D phenomenon, and not just the creators at, you know, TSR back then and all the subsistence, you know, companies that have come since, or all the variety of different games that were in competition, even though most people weren't aware of them at the time. It's the fan base, the reader, you know, us, our influences have changed a lot of things. Anyway, we can talk about the dwarf clans and guilds, new clans, city of dwarves, loyalties, love of stability, dwarven crafts, dwarves and humor. Let's touch on that for a second. Dwarves are viewed as humorless, if not downright grumpy, by other races. This is a fair assessment. They do not often tell jokes and have no appreciation of practical jokes. Society is based on law and order and respect for one's fellows. The dwarf does not abuse that respect by ridiculing another's dignity. They don't make fun of each other. Dwarves love to work and find pleasure in it. The pleasure is so spiritually uplifting that any attempt at humor appears facile. Those who are not content with work or their position in life may need such diversion, but humor is seen as an insult. That is not to say dwarves are humorless. They have a very black humor considering their racial enemies, but their sense of humor is very different from that of humans, for example. They do not find the jokes of personal suffering or failure funny. They do not find those based upon clever stories entertaining. Problem with the dwarven jokes tend to follow a standard narrative pattern. Because of their great length, endless genealogies, and catalogs of dwarven concerns, it is difficult for other races to maintain any interest in them. The dwarf comedians telling jokes to other races are frequently annoyed when the audience attention slips after 15 minutes or so, or when the audience has no concept of the importance of lineage in the joke's punch paragraph. Races who have been subject to the dwarven humor fail to realize that it does not rely on the delivery of one-liners, but on the slow presentation of a chapter, if not an entire book. They talk about wealth. And I know Rob was very articulated in when he described it, and he did a good job of it. This is, dwarves are attracted to the objects for their intrinsic beauty and not for any commercial value. They prize the fine workmanship, but know that craftsman is only augmented what the earth provided. So they collect wealth for the sake of collecting wealth, and for the fact that it gives them stability and another form of security, if you will. As well, you know, they're not misers. They're not these greedy coin counting people in a dark room somewhere whose cackling over their every copper piece. We got crafts, individualism, and this goes hand in hand with that. Dwarves willingly live under lawful institution respecting privacy or personal space. Law induces order, organization, and stable society. Society reflects the natural order of the world with everything in its proper place. Law exists to be obeyed and not broken. Society exists so dwarves may be free from unnecessary intrusions. Even though law is important, dwarves are fairly individualistic. They have personal views in which they rarely make known to others. However, they seem to be taciturn race. However, when a dwarf thinks that his own views is not being heard, he will become grumpy, silent, and bear his distress stoically. His stoicism and his desire not to grieve others is evident in the way that they view wealth as a private matter. Only powerful and respected dwarves are expected to display wealth openly, and even then, ostentatious displays are frowned upon. All dwarves are expected to prefer to keep their wealth hidden. It's considered bad manners to flaunt accumulated wealth. Such behavior is offensive and has caused dwarves who travel in the service world to be deeply insulted. Wealth, particularly gems and precious metals, are for the personal delight. It should be carefully hoarded and displayed for one's closest family or cherished friends. It is a mark of acceptance and friendship among dwarves for one to reveal his wealth. By doing so, he is not only sharing the joy of his possession, but is saying, "You are my friend, whom I trust not to steal from me." The exception to this, of course, is wealth displayed through an excellent craftsmanship and a utilitarian item. A beautifully crafted gilded axe and inlaid gem or two is not ostentatious if it is functional. Dwarves claim this is not a subjective distinction, but most other races find it hard to follow the reasoning. And we got emotions. Private people, dwarves often have difficulty expressing emotion. Their society structure on making displays of anger, envy, jealousy, hatred unnecessary. They are capable of harboring grudges and hatreds, but these are usually directed outside of the stronghold. Dwarves rarely insult or distress each other, but other races distress them greatly, not giving them the respect they demand, and inquiring casually about wealth, or making them the butts of jokes are guaranteed to make dwarves angry. That this anger will normally only show itself in front of a scowl or a contraction of the brows. Other races have concluded, therefore, that dwarves are humorless, and not realizing that dwarves do not release their anger. They allow it to simmer and increase until they explode, becoming their own stereotypes, crumpling, taciturn, stubborn, and unyielding. Dwarves often despair at the extremely poor manners of other races. This helps understand why the elves, in their own way, avoid the lesser races or avoid other races other than their own, to avoid attachments that become painful. As Rob points out, to avoid subjecting themselves to unnecessary pain because of their aging, the way they age, and the way their society set. The dwarves are often clannish and close-knit group, and rarely feel comfortable outside of that group. They might some dwarves might find a way to substitute the player characters of their traveling companions for a close-knit group over time, but they never really 100% open up except under extreme situations, extreme cases. The lion's share of them are going to always seem grumpy or standoffish or annoyed all the time, and in part because in their mind they're being put upon and they're being misunderstood, and they're being offended repeatedly by these actions of these others, because culturally speaking they're not on the same page. This helps explain why outwardly they always seem grumpy and angry or standoffish, not aloof as like elves would be, and being mildly amused by the antics of the lesser races, but being angry and annoyed and put off by the seemingly lack of seriousness and the lack of manners of these lesser races or these other cultures. And that basically translates into attitude towards other races, war to the death. Now, dwarves do not compromise in dealing with evil races, particularly when competing with them for living space or their welfare is threatened. Their hatred of evil races and ancients for themselves. Originally, wars were fought to determine blah blah. Isolationism. The dwarves' desire for isolation should not be surprised. Clannish by nature, many are suspicious of even dwarves from other clans. To say nothing of other strongholds, it is among mountain dwarves that isolation is strongest. Mountain dwarves prefer not to deal with other races. They even have difficulty understanding the hill dwarves. Some of them believe that the hill dwarves have become contaminated by living too closely with other races. The hill dwarves have lost the rock of their dwarvishness. Dwarven hearths, marriage. Now, it is a subject that a lot of dwarves become obsessed with perfection, or the pursuit of perfection, especially in their craftsmanship. They do the same thing in their relationships, according to everything I read. They have a tendency to desire one specific maiden, if you will, and if they can't have her, then they're content to never have anyone else, and they will suffer it stoically in silence and yearn from afar, kind of thing. They also are married for life, so if the male or the female dies, the male's not going to go looking for another mate. On the other hand, because of their culture and the fact that on the average is 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 dwarves are female, the females will have a tendency to be arranged marriage to another male if one can be found in all opportunity, in order to keep and it's not about, it says the dwarves are not romantics. This vast majority are arranged by the clan elders. Main concern is to secure the continuation of the clan. The average gestation takes a year. They rarely have twins. They never have anything more than, never had triplets or larger group. It's not uncommon for one pair of mated dwarves to have one offspring in their entire lifetime. So the fact that the dwarves are in a lot of attrition over time in combat, this is why we don't see vast numbers of them, in part because their slow birth rate, and the fact that there's a lot less intermarriage going on in the race, that means that they are slow to replace losses. They barely maintain the status quo in some aspects, depending on the worlds. The females are no less different than the males when it comes to this sort of attitude about possession. They are seeking somebody, and if they can't necessarily have the male that they admire, they may not accept anybody else. And their society will not exactly happy with it. Will always respect their wishes. Since they are dwarves and they're not romantics, the main concern is to secure sexual males for eligible candidates, ensure that the family has a warm and secure place to live. The dwarf society is about 1/3 female. Dwarves are monogamous, and marriages are entered into for life. That, along with the fact that males outnumber females about 2 to 1, means that many males do not marry. A woman who loses her spouse will, after a year of mourning, remarry. Grandparents play an important role in child rearing, as do parents. Elders find mates for widowed grandmothers. Divorce does not exist in Dwarven society. Couples who have grown distant from one another will continue to share the hearth of the responsibility of child rearing. Only death can end a marriage. This life cycle of the dwarves: apprenticeship, marriable age, adult life, the Dwarven diet, clothing. And there's just one that I thought was interesting. Dwarven clothing tends to be heavy, somewhat somber in color, and serviceable, made from a thick wool or spun strands of fungi. It is designed to keep the dwarves warm in unheated places in their strongholds. To the untrained eye, colors are uniformly drab grays and browns. The Dwarven language has over 500 words for rock, and almost as many to describe the different rock hues. Particular shades of gray and brown reveal much about the clan and status of dwarves, if one has the eye to see. So what they're saying is that the dwarves have a different view of color, and so they understand the many varying shades of gray. And so to sit there and say they all have a drab color scheme going on is only to the outside observer. To the inside member of the particular clan or race, they can look at 10 different, what appears to be 10 different gray cloaks, and each one has a subtle difference in shading, and they appreciate the differences and actually can visually see them. Music and singing. Dwarves love to sing. Talks about playing instruments. Mostly they like to sing as a group. It's a group effort. Then we get into character creation. At this particular timeline of the book system, we had an increase of the changes mechanics-wise. The original character races or character classes were beginning to expand in these extra source books, these additional sources for material, not just in things like the monster manuals and player handbooks. At the time, though, they weren't considered subclasses. They called them kits briefly, and then it became a subclass, which was what they should have been at the beginning, but what do I know? Let's see. In this case, they also talk about what they've changed, some of the adjustments of what dwarves could play. They can now play clerics or warrior clerics or cleric warriors. In some extreme cases, they can actually play wizards, although most likely a warrior wizard or a wizard craftsman who's going to use most of his magic to imbue items that are far more durable than the flash in the pan stuff that they see other races using magic for. Let's see, Hill Dwarves, Deep Dwarves, Duger, basic stats, stuff like this, Sunder Dwarves, Gully Dwarves. You know, I've used a few Gully Dwarves as NPCs in the past, but I have yet to ever play one as a character, and it would be a big challenge since they tend to not want to be in combat, and they tend to be the most filthiest thing in the neighborhood. As a matter of fact, it's a common joke in some of this literature that even a goblin would goblins would turn up their noses at the Gully Dwarf possessions and/or place of residence. This shows you how bad they are, but nobody I know of ever played them actively as a character class. So it'd be interesting if anybody out there has actually done that and how they viewed it and how it turned out for them. Let's see. Non-weapon proficiency group, specialty weapons. Let's see. Non-weapon proficiencies, alertness, armor, bow right, blind fighting, fungi recognition, Jim cunning, endurance. Interesting to know that there are some. This is one of the things I always liked about these extra books. They introduce things that wouldn't additional add-ons, and there's a lot of people say, well, they're not necessary. There's already enough stuff in the core book or the core player handbooks. Why add additional things? Well, you know, there's some aspect. This is what sets them apart from other characters. So a dwarf with direction sense, well, they all have a tendency to it, but we actually have a proficiency in it, or a skill. We have the basic rule for it. They can increase their ability in that aspect. The same thing with, you know, additional interesting stuff. Boat right does not turn up very often, so having it available for gaming purposes is always nice. Fungi recognition. Okay, who needs to know this stuff? Well, obviously a race that's spent a lot of time underground does. So if you had a campaign where you're dealing with the underworld, having a player with a character who has this ability could be crucial, or an interesting element to the play. Gem cutting, intimidation, local dwarf history, mining, locksmithing, pest control. There's a theme in here, runs through this book that I found kind of odd, but it makes sense to some degree. Let's see. Alright, so dwarf kits. It says dwarf kits in this chapter allow for further individualization of the dwarven characters. Each kit is a collection of abilities. Basically, these are sub-races, or subclasses of the dwarven classes. You know, the fighter, priest, and thief. So the fact that they were calling them kits back then is what makes it a little confusing for people who pick up the book now. So from the warrior subclasses, we get animal master, axe for hire, clan's dwarf, the traditional standard dwarf that you'd find, the hearth guard, which is a female dwarf, especially who has spent her lifetime training to defend the home and family, the battle rager. This is one of after the Drizzt Do'Urden books started coming out, and Quint is a colorful character in those books, and the fact he's a battle rager drew a lot of interest, and I think that his character was designed after the books came out after these came out, and I'm guessing that the Plint character is to show off this particular subclass of dwarf, and it is the equivalent of a dwarf barbarian taken to the next level. So, just so you know, and it can be played in similar form. Then we got the Highborn. There's a number of literature, books, and movies and so on where you have dwarves, and then you have nobles. You have noble dwarves, and there's a distinct difference in them. You go to a different game system altogether. The old Star Wars, the old Western Games versions, has its version of a noble class, and it confuses. And the reason is because Princess Leia is a noble, but she's a statesman. She's a statesman, also a diplomat, a statesman, a politician. So all those combined. But she's a princess. She's born with a set of different set of values and training. And then later, when the movies come out, we see that similar but not necessarily the same thing in Amidala. She's not a princess per se. She's an elected member of the government with a title that called her this, the Queen of Naboo, but she's not actually a noble. She's not royalty, but she's raised in the same version of a highborn category. She's a statesman, a diplomat. From very young age, she's trained to fit these roles. So it was not uncommon in her society for a young woman or young man to be titled the queen or king or what have you for a political reason. The outcast, the rapid response rider, the sharpshooter. You imagine a dwarven sniper. The mechanics are here for awesome. This is one I never played, but I always was in the back of my head if I had the opportunity to do so in the right kind of campaign. This would have been a great subclass to play. Can't see it, but there it is. Sharpshooter is highly skilled with either the light or heavy crossbow. He spent the majority of his youth training as a boy or fletcher and had regular practice with the crossbow. Skilled rapid reloading, expert at inflicting most damage possible with his weapon. Excluding confidence in the abilities, he tends to disdain those who resort to hand-to-hand combat. This is a rare individual in a dwarf, because most dwarves believe in this, and everything that they read about them, they believe in your face, up close and personal, aggressive combat. They don't go on the defensive; they go on the offensive. Their defense is an intense offense, and if they do go defensive, they become a wall. They literally stop and link arms or link weapons and do their level best to murder anything that gets within range of them. And then, as soon as the opportunity presents itself, they press the attack. They go forward. They charge. So to find somebody who's willing to sit back and press the attack, sit back and use ranged weapons in a society who don't generally use ranged weapons, to set this person apart. And there's some good rolls with that and some bad rolls with that. It would be considered possibly an odd character amongst other dwarves. Then we got priest kits: the crafts priest, the pariah, the patrician, the ritual priest. Then we got the warrior priest kits, the champion. This is their equivalent of a paladin. The temple guard, the vindicator. Then we got the thief kits: the diplomat, the entertainer, the locksmith, the pest controller. Entertainer. This is interesting. The dwarves enjoy entertainment during leisure hours, so other races are surprised that there are dwarves whose trade is entertaining. There are dancers, singers, jugglers, tremblers, musicians, tightrope walkers, and fire eaters. They rarely tell jokes. To be an entertainer, blah blah. Like most dwarf trades, entertainers are governed by hymns, and elves often find the sight of dwarf entertainers gambling around the stage hilariously funny, much to the annoyance of the entertainers and the dwarves in the audience. The performance of an entertainer is meant to display the physical prowess of the dwarf in an edifying manner. They're certainly not meant to be laughed at. So what we're talking about is seeing a dwarf acrobat is quite plausible, quite doable, but their motivation for doing it is not to, gerrymander around the stage, making an ass out of themselves, but to display their strength and agility and quickness and ability to do these things and do them well, and they take it seriously when people start laughing at them. They don't care for it, which is one of the reasons you might not see a lot of dwarf entertainers entertaining non-dwarven communities. And the warrior thief kits, the ghetto fighter. I've liked this particular one for years, and one of the reasons for that is I don't know how many campaigns and player characters I've had over the years where people have said, well, my dwarf grew up in the lower end of town, and this is how come he's a rogue, and on and on and on. Well, if he initially started out in that situation, here's a good way to get him started. The ghetto fighter. Ghetto fighters live in the ghettos of non-dwarven towns or cities, generally from poor families. They've had to look after themselves from an early age. The typical ghetto fighter is a hard-bitten, self-centered attitude developing in order to survive the rigors of the ghetto. Ghetto fighters may come from dwarf strongholds, blah, 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 blah. So you've got this combination of fighter-thief, and it helps justify their title. Their class justifies where they come. And we got our trader, Vermin Slayer. Now, ironically enough, Vermin Slayer and Pest Slayer, or Pest Control, are two different types of subclasses and or proficiencies combined that are these individuals who like to go and it's like rat hunting, but they're very professional at how they go about it, and to the point where they have no trouble climbing into these tiny warrens and squeezing through tunnel systems that most others would not even dare attempt, and learning how to fight in such close quarters makes them some pretty nasty individuals in a tight combat situation. And in a community, large communities, where the possibility of vermin, in this case, they're including such things as cobalt goblins, germanes, any number of giant rats, centipedes, and other pests, and so on and so forth. The ability to get rid of these pests is very valuable, even if they did have a tendency to be looked askance at. Dwarves are not going to necessarily look down on other dwarves, let alone ridicule them for their job choices, although this would happen in other societies. The fact that these individuals tend to do some of the most disgusting role jobs that are available, in the eyes of some people, makes them a bit of an outsider. But not always so. The Wayfinder. This is the Dwarven Scout. This is the closest thing I've seen so far to a Dwarven Ranger. And it's an interesting subclass. Very interesting. And we get into role-playing and personalities. And this is the kind of the kernel of the whole point of these videos, was to give a wider range to our Dwarven characters and to encourage players to not play them as human. It says, other races tend to stereotype dwarves, lumping them together as suspicious, avarice, taciturn, abstinent, grumpy, grim, and humorless creatures. They see them as rigid and unyielding as stone, while grudgingly admitting that dwarves are hardy and tenacious fighters. While all that is true, this gross generalization, many dwarves will not fit neatly into another race's conception of them. No two are exactly alike. They have many of the same characteristics, character kit, but each has its own goals, interests, quirks, flaws, setting them apart from their fellows. They are, however, certain discerning qualities shared by the race. The Dwarven personality. Get lost is a Dwarven maxim. Dwarves are not humans with short legs, broad torsos, and long beards. They are another race entirely with distinctive personalities and beliefs that set them apart from humans. Playing a dwarf is more challenging than playing a human warrior. As humans, we know the basic traits and portray them easily. It's more difficult to make the dwarves believable and fun, but potentially reward is worth the effort. Basic personality. Dwarves are molded by the many factors that see themselves as a proud and noble race, maintaining their own ways, not because they are stubborn, but because the experience has taught them that their ways are best. They do not understand why other races consider them dour and taciturn. Believing there is a time and place for everything, dwarves approach work seriously with an attitude of commitment. Dealing with other races is always seen as work, and dwarves always work solemnly. While this has led to the false portrayals, dwarves don't care. They know that they are superior to all other races. If others fail to recognize this, it's not the dwarves' loss. They're content to leave the others alone unless they're in direct conflict or competition for living space or resources. When intact, the entire strong will fight. Knowing how the race generally feels about most things helps define the individual. Dwarven personalities. So they actually give us a small suggestion or a list. They call the Decadent, the Glory Seeker, the Grumbler, the Hoarder, the Optimist, the Paragon, the Phobic, the Statesman, the Pragmatist. And then we get into subchapters on mining, metals, gemstones. I found this section quite useful in a number of campaigns for just basic background information and things. Placing mines, like how to operate mines, how to work them, rules for actually managing a mine, rules for a smelter, and we got some new weapons. I found it interesting, a lot of these new weapons are quite suited to the Battle Raider, imagine that. And then we got some war machines, section on how to make dwarf strongholds, how to roll them up randomly, government, age, types of strongholds, resources, add twos, so forth, war and peace, war, duration, the militia, deep dwarves, Ruger, stats, blah blah blah, special forces. Then we have the stronghold of Bazaraka, and some basic information, so you can have a campaign using that, or you have this chapter on divining a dwarf campaign. And I've run at least three that come to mind. Three different. I've run at least 3 different campaigns in my lifetime that were solely 100% dwarf characters, and it is an interesting way of taking on things, especially since a lot of those humorous human nature thing that we tend to do is the sort of stuff that you could easily translate over into an all-dwarven campaign, because at this point the dwarves are among friends or among associates and can let things out a little bit. Just putting that out there, right? So then we'll go and look at J.R. Tolkien's take on this particular subject. We got dwarves, and I'm not going to go through everything. Tribes of the Seven Fathers, the history during founding, the Golden Years, the Second Age, the migration of the elves, the fate of the Seven Dwarven Rings, coming of the Balrog, War of Naming of Moria, blah blah blah, loss of Durin's Rings, Baln's return. This is all history. And the descriptions of the others, the lesser tribes of the seven, the quest to coming to Mura, conquest, dwarven nature. All dwarves are descendants of the Seven Fathers, the original lords crafted from the earth. Elves administrative of nature, Ur's grand scream and shape, they conform the balance of things, blah blah. Dwarves awoke in a strong, vigorous race. They're vulnerable to greed, and yet rock hard, stubborn, yet practical, slow to love, yet fast in friendship. No other race is as rugged nor resistant to hunger, hurt, or toil. Dwarves can endure the longest journeys without a word, or withstand fire and cold without flinching. Dwarves are also dear to the heart. Although the seven tribes assume to awaken lesser beings, their agreements with extreme care. Like one of my co-workers just left one of the trucks. Physical characteristics. Let's see. Seven tribes, they remain close. Dwarf treats his kind as brothers, non-dwarves as lesser beings who, one way or another, are a constant threat. Blood is thick and their bonds are deep. They enter into agreements with extreme care, but once made, honor them to the letter. The old adage is true: no friend ever did a dwarf a favor, no enemy a wrong without being repaid in full. The dwarves are quick to quarrel even among their own houses. They suffer from jealousy like others speaking peoples. They will protect their brethren from outside enemies with unswerving fury. They will answer any call to war on behalf of their race. The dwarves enjoy a universal reputation for ruggedness, practicality, brutal frankness, and honor. Outwardly cold, they love things and devices crafted in their hand much more than things that breathe with life. Most groups favor rocky highlands and deep caverns. Blah blah. Physical characteristics. 200 to 400 years lifespan. The manner of dwarves. Dwarves are sober, quiet, possessive, suspicious, pugnacious, introspective, and greedy. These characters led them to seclude themselves in strongholds around rich veins of iron and precious metals. There they mine at great works of superb craftsmanship while guarding their hoards with awareness and approaches paranoia. Like their maker, they are fabulous smiths and unsurpassed workers of stone. Dwarven items are often stunningly beautiful, but practically underlines all their artifice. This attitude also affects their views on magic. Dwarves know of spells and enchantments, but scoff the ways that elves and other conjurers, preferring instead to use such power in making permanent physical items. Dwarven mages are unheard of. And yet, over and over again, there's references to the rare possible dwarf wizard. The dwarves are also known for the military prowess, superbly equipped on leading in purpose. They fight without a thought of retreat or quarter. Favor overpowering weapons as rugged and brutal as the dwarves themselves. Heavy crossbows, axes, hammers, and war manocks, wearing heavy armor and cruel-looking helmets, with cowls, face visors, and masks resembling terrifying horned beasts. The force of dwarven warriors presents a formidable and disturbing profile. Dwarf women, relatively unfertile, lacking women. Dwarves rarely sire children, even take wives. Basically, a third of the race is composed of a dwarf women. Many of them desire mates they cannot have. Fewer than 1 in 3 dwarf men marry with a dwarf mate for light, and they will not join with one they do not desire above all. All others, like the most rare jewel, the female dwarves, are then coveted and obsessively protected in ways unlike those of any other race. Fortunately, dwarves are enamored of crafts. Many never crave to love another, so they need no martial union. This introspective fascination of arts and creation encourages the stability among the race, easily torn by envy and umbrage. Dwarf women are a proud lot, fiercely protective of their rights. They stand as equals in all affairs but those of war. Dwarves face no restrictions on the status of their mobility, although they're traveling less than dwarf men. Those they require secure dwellings for their birthings and for their offspring, and so remain sheltered from the rest of the world. In fact, dwarf women are so remote and rarely recognized that some believe they do not exist. Since their voice and visage is akin to those of the males, the false legends are strengthened. Even now, many men presume dwarves just grow from stone. Worship and ritual, language. A lot of cultures believe that the Dwarven language is a secret language that's purposely hidden from everybody, blah, blah, blah. And the truth is, it's not so. It's just that the dwarves, generally, like everything else, are reluctant to share trade secrets, crafts, knowledge, and sharing their own language falls in that category. The language is meant for dwarves and not dwarves alone. So it's a rare non-dwarf who can read or speak the language. This is one of the things in Lord of the Rings that set Elrod apart from most other elves. He was one of the few elves who actually took the time to master the Dwarven language. This is why Thorin and under the guidance of Gandalf approached him with help to understand the map of the Lonely Mountain. And the fact that he was able to read the dwarf runes surprised Thorin immensely. Let's see, during Smoke, Dwarven technology. It says, the Age of the Valor, Elven Society, Undying Lands, create the greatest works ever achieved by the children of Uru within the Middle Earth. However, only the dwarves can claim supremacy as pure builders. Dwarven construction, particularly underground, is unrivaled in its strength and scale, and of all the legacies of the dwarves, none surpass Moria. Dwarven fascination for inanimate things born of craftsmanship permeates every level of their thought and their society. Every active, they're always laboring, either improving or repairing an old work, or building something new. Their unique devotion to toil traditionally channels most of their physical and mental energies into material tasks, thus creating the dwarves' utter preoccupation with technology. Dwarf culture embraces its engineers, masons, smiths, scientists, workers, warriors with a vigor found nowhere else. So there's the thought for a minute. I mentioned this before in my video about the larger culture as a whole having many specialists, and as a player character wanting to stretch, who loves to play dwarves or has never played dwarves but would like to, and would like to stretch that dwarfs into a different kind of a personality type, or to take this non-standard cookie cutter idea of a dwarven warrior and give it a different twist. Here's some examples. Why not role play a dwarf who is an engineer or a mason or an actual smith or a scientist? You know, I'm just saying. There you go, Rob. You've got that vibe. How about role playing a scientist first, a dwarven warrior second, and see how that rolls out. Hardly surprising when the dwarves are the most technologically advanced race in the Middle Earth. Dwarfsmiths, the most prominent dwarven craftsmen, blah blah blah, was not implement, blah blah. You know, engineers assemble phenomenal devices of less than toil and accomplish feats unheard of elsewhere. Simple machines like pulleys, levers, counterbalances, coiled tension springs, wheeled carts, sledges, gears, and screws are commonplace. Combination of these mechanisms, often very complex and sophisticated engines, are deployed when required. Most are located in the mine, smithy, crafts hall, and lord's hall, or other critical areas. So, you know, they could build the concept of elevators and movable walls, and they embrace them in very clever traps and defensive works to begin with. They also create machines for production, increasing the ability, enhancing a lot of the methods for smithing and for mine working, working mines and so forth. There's some great scenes in The Hobbit where the 13 dwarves and Bilbo are basically playing catch, or playing hide and seek with Smaug inside of Erebor, and you see these vast works, these huge overhead chainways with these big cauldrons and machines and gears and levers and all this other stuff. And I've heard some people who didn't read the books, haven't have as deep of love or knowledge for the particular race, and thought, well, that's just fictional fluff and BS that Peter Jackson threw in there. And to me, I looked at it and I thought it fit. It is the very sort of mass production, large scale operation one would expect from such a wealthy dwarven citadel or city. And every bit of it's believable to me, and that they would do it. And even to the point where the huge mold for the gold statue of Thorin Oakenshield's great grandfather, who at the time was the last sitting king under the mountain, who was under the influence of one of the 7 dwarf rings from Sauron, and was utterly consumed with the concept of personal wealth, in his vanity, and in much, I imagine, to the horror and chagrin and anger of many of his subordinates, of the population, decided to build this massive golden edifice of himself that is then used to try to, kill Smaug later, which was, that particular part was, well, a desperate move, an act of desperation, and I applauded it. It was just pure, foolhardy stupidity, because, in the back of their mind, at least some of them dwarves had to be going, there ain't no fire hot enough, they're going to mess with the dragon. I'm just saying, trying to bury him under a lake of gold, molten gold, would have killed just about anything else except a full-on venerable red dragon. That just pissed them off. And what did it do? Pissed them off. So, anyway, machinery, dwarven warcraft, pretty much everything you say the same. And then we got dwarven trade. Despite their pugnacity, the dwarves appear to deal on more civil terms. Dwarves from Moria travel the course of foremost, Narthane minus Arnor and Gondor. Couriers frequent pass between the East Gate and Lorne. Emissaries from other dwarf halls assert the needs of the first house. Most of diplomacy revolves around trade, for dwarves sign no treaties and war only on the behalf of their tribe or their race. Dwarf holds are both self-sufficient and jealously guarded, with their hunger for still greater wealth, blah blah blah. Now, when we talk about dwarven combat, that's something that's well documented. There was some other stuff in here, and I don't really want to get into it, but if you ever had an opportunity to get this book, or a PDF of it, for the reading pleasure and backstory knowledge for your campaigns, and it's a great thing. This is Volume 3 of the Lords of Middle-earth for the Middle-earth role-playing game system, or MERP, Hobbits, Dwarves, Ents, Orcs, Orc Trolls, a fantasy game character compendium. The thing here is we got most of the overview of the 7 dwarven clans, if you will, or 7 dwarven tribes. And there are a couple very interesting stories to talk in here. We're not talking Durin and stuff. We're talking from the other tribes, and including some of their homes, their citadels, their kingdoms, if you will, were laid out, and how they fell. And the creation of them gives some great information, great ideas for building dwarven cities and citadels and what have you. So, there you have it. And yet, one more take on the dwarf. And I think at some future point, I might take a stab at doing the elves. But, ironically, there's a lot more information on elves in a variety of cultural applications than there are on dwarves, which I find is kind of ironic, considering how, of the 4 goodly races, the humans, halflings, elves, and dwarves, you can toss in gnomes and a handful of others, but the four basics that started with in the original D&D, the old school stuff, and have progressed to the modern stuff today. The dwarves are the least well known, the most secretive race, but they're one of the most played races too. Next to humans and halflings, dwarves are played. I think probably dwarves are played more often than halflings. You know, it's human and then dwarf, then halfling, then elf. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you don't have that same opinion, but that's an observation I've had for 40 years of this game hobby. I'm just pointing out that one of the most beloved playable classes, we know the least amount in game material, in splat books, in source books, or what have you. Right now, sitting in the overhead above me, in this pile of books next to me, and in the overhead behind me, I have seven books that pertain to elves. You know, directly or indirectly, they retain to elves. Out of all my other books, these are the only 2 that have anything significant about dwarves. And not only do I have entire modules and source books revolving around elves and elven adventures and elven cities, I've got several. There's another. You notice that Volume 3 does not include elves. It's hobbits, dwarves, and orcs and trolls. Volume 2, or 1, I think it's Volume 1, is half the books devoted to elves and the various subclasses of elves and their beliefs for Lord of the Rings, or for Middle-earth. And then I have the complete book of elves. I have an updated version of that. I have Evermeet, which is the elven, I don't want to call it a homeland, but it's a very large island home of some very powerful elves in Forgotten Realms. I've got Mythdraenor, and I've got 2 or 3 other source books that apply mostly to the elves in Forgotten Realms. I have at least 3 books devoted for, in one box set, if you call it Misvistvan, or how do you want to pronounce Drizzt Do'Urden's homeland, the Drow. So there's even more information on Drow now than there are on elves, or it's in close proximity, therefore. So, these are only 2 books, and I've got a dozen and counting right now just coming into my mind of books that are heavily influenced by the elves and their background, their backstory, and so on and so forth. Very interesting thing. There you go. Thank you for joining me, and game on.